What's up guys, my name is Sean from White Jade Production, and this video is talking about how to not sound like a newbie when talking about cinema cameras. Okay, so say maybe you're a videographer or a self-taught cinematographer who's breaking into the film industry. Oftentimes, those new to the filmmaking industry tend to question the validity of cinema cameras, especially when there are a lot of new, powerful mirrorless cameras that seem to be able to do the job even on big budget films. So here's some things I hear people say about both cinema cameras and mirrorless cameras that let me know they don't have much experience. So pay attention closely throughout this video so you can avoid sounding new or spot those who are new to the filmmaking industry. Now, the first point on my list is cinema cameras are too big. Wow, do I hear this one a lot. Usually this comment comes from people who are also trying to rig out their mirrorless cameras to be as large as possible. And of course, the moment they hold an actual cinema rig, they realize that maybe their camera size isn't really built up to the same thing, and they tend to just think that these cameras are incredibly heavy, when in reality, a small and light cinema rig can be anywhere from 10 to 20 pounds. Now, cinema cameras just are heavy, and that's for a number of reasons. The first is the image sensor's temperature. The cameras have to be big to have a large heat sink. Cinema cameras never overheat, and more importantly, they're meant to keep the sensor temperature consistent, and that's how you get less noise out of cinema camera sensors. They just generally are less noisy, and that's because they keep the sensors at a very specific temperature. It avoids help tint and white balance shift as well, and keep colors accurate throughout the entire day of shooting, because usually cinema cameras don't power off for 8 or more hours a day. Now, they are also large because they need to have a lot of ports, expandability, and riggability. Mirrorless cameras are trickier to rig out on steady cams, dollies, easy rigs, and ready rigs, so you need to have a camera that's large enough and heavy enough to support those kinds of camera apparatuses. Point number 2, and this is usually the thing people like to say right after I debunk their first point, and that is they're really expensive. Now, that is not the greatest comeback with cameras out there like the Sony F5 and F55, the Panasonic VariCam, and the Red Dragon 6K that all run for about half the price to 2/3 of the price of an FX3. I wouldn't exactly go around saying that cinema cameras are expensive. Of course, on the other side of this, yes, there are expensive cameras like the ARRI Alexa Mini LF, which runs almost up to the 6-figure mark, hitting right around $98,000. But honestly, cameras like that, the Alexa 65, and many of Panavision's cameras aren't even accessible to the public, not because of price, but they simply just don't sell certain cameras because they're not meant to be sold. They're meant to be rented. Not many people purchase these cameras. Most of these cameras are sold to rental houses to rent out to productions because it's usually included in the budget of the film. And in fact, you don't even have to have a crazy large budget to be able to rent a camera like the ARRI Alexa Mini LF or an ARRI 35. It's not actually as pricey as you might think. Now, the third point has some validity to it when you come from a videography or solo shooter perspective. Unfortunately, that's not what filmmaking is about. Filmmaking is about collaboration, and when I hear people say, ooh, but cinema cameras don't have autofocus, or they don't have good autofocus, I immediately just cringe up because you don't need autofocus when you're filmmaking. If you have a project that is budgeted whatsoever, you should have an AC pulling focus for you. In all honesty, if you have enough budget to actually be producing a film or a spec ad or any other project for real, you should have an AC pulling focus for you. And on larger sets, they will probably be using focused assist systems that make DJI's LiDAR system look like a kid's toy. Now, autofocus can be very useful, but when you're on a set where there are planned camera movements, blocking, and actual thought out shot maps, there should be no excuse after 1, maybe 2 rehearsals that the AC shouldn't absolutely have the focus down. And if you have to be your own AC and pull focus manually from your camera, there's no reason you shouldn't have the movement and points down to as well. And if you don't know what to do, just set down some marks, attach that to your camera. You should be able to feel vibrations if you're using an electronic motor. It is as easy as 1, 2, 3. Granted, there are some useful moments for autofocus, and I would say those rely solely in reaction-based filmmaking like documentary where you have to capture something. If you're not a very skilled focus puller, which I think most DPs should be, as you generally do start out as a camera assistant, then yeah, autofocus might be useful to you if you're doing an interview. It might be useful if you can't man a C-cam, for example. However, generally within filmmaking, especially collaborative filmmaking with other people on real sets with real budget, there should absolutely be no use for autofocus. It is entirely people-based, and that allows the creativity and artistic expression of the director, most importantly, and next the DP, really flow through and get embedded within the project. Having focus be a little soft sometimes does tell the proper story because it doesn't look mechanical. It feels real. And when you're trying to tell emotion, real is important above all else. On to my fourth point. It is incredibly obvious when people come up to me or go into my YouTube comments and say something like, oh, but the color science in my camera is almost as good or just as good or better than your cinema camera's color science, or even say that they don't even need RAW or their external RAW from their camera is actually just as good. There's nothing that says to me that you are newer to the filmmaking industry, or honestly cameras as a whole, than saying something like that. Now, that is an incredibly poor argument, and as far as color science go, I would say yes. If you're a non-experienced colorist or you tend to use LUTs, yes, a mirrorless camera will look better in your hands than a cinema camera. But just because it looks better in your hands doesn't mean it is better. And that really comes down to skill. An experienced colorist or DP will absolutely be able to pull out a better looking images with better colors and better flexibility out of a cinema camera. They just have more flexibility in terms of dynamic range, which comes from their bit depth. And they'll also just be able to manipulate the colors in ways that you won't be able to coming from a mirrorless camera. Now, just because the colors from your mirrorless camera don't necessarily break when you try and manipulate them, doesn't mean the direction you're pulling them in is the way they're actually going. In my experience, it's a whole lot easier to grade fast mirrorless camera footage. However, when I'm actually working on a real project and I have a client asking me to do very specific things with the color, or maybe nail a specific look of yellows, greens, blues, or reds, I find that shooting with the cinema camera makes that a whole lot easier, and generally my clients are a lot more happy. Now, just as a little side note, if your raw footage cannot be manipulated directly from your camera into DaVinci Resolve, it's not very good, and it's not even acting as a true raw codec. At that point, you might as well stick to a more lossy codec instead. One of my biggest pet peeves, and another thing that people who think they're experienced but aren't tend to do, is claim that their external RAW or internal RAW from their mirrorless camera is as good as B-RAW, R3D, or even ProRes, just lossy codecs out of like an ARRI Alexa. It's just not as flexible because you generally have to do work with those codecs to even get them into Resolve. And if you can import directly into Resolve, such as B-RAW from the Lumix cameras via the Blackmagic Video Assist, you still only have so much flexibility. The camera isn't built to have the right noise patterns because it does rely on noise reduction. Same deal with Sony. Many people complain with Sony that their cameras are no longer good low light cameras when they shoot RAW with like the Atomos Ninja 5, or soon they'll be shooting with B-RAW. They're gonna find that actually they'd rather shoot in a lossy codec because the camera's noise pattern and noise reduction / compression within the camera is so much better than having the ability of RAW, just because those cameras aren't built for RAW. Thank you for putting up with that real quick tangent. On to point number 5. My mirrorless camera is good in low light and your cinema camera isn't. This is probably one of the most annoying things anybody in the cinema space could possibly hear. Whether you're a DP, a gaffer, an AC, or anybody else who does anything with cameras, it is so incredibly annoying because it couldn't be more wrong. Now, I don't mean that it's more wrong in the sense that cinema cameras are better at low light. It's just that it's an argument that doesn't apply. When you're using a cinema camera, you're usually doing something that involves cinema, which involves a gaffer and grips and lights. And you don't need a low light camera when you have lights. So to that point, I would just say that, yeah, a low light camera is nice to have. Having dual native ISO or dual gain ISO is definitely appreciated. And there are a lot of cinema cameras that do have dual gain ISO. In fact, Red does with their Gemini 5K. It was used for documentary, and that was a complaint. People wish they had better low light, so they gave them better low light. But honestly, the difference between a camera or a cinema camera with a dual base of, say, 6400 and a camera that is exceptional at low light, like the FX3 with its dual base of 12,800, is still only one stop of light. That's the difference from f2 to 2.8 or f2 to 1.4. I would say that it's just better to use the camera that you want to use and maybe grab a set of faster lenses. In my opinion, having that extra low light feature is seldom useful in documentaries, but mostly useful if you just want to shoot for fun or maybe a cheap spec ad with your friends where you might need to shoot at night. Other than that, I don't see a use for it within the cinema space. This is kind of a bonus point. It's not really a part of the real list, mostly because it's a little more personal to me and my take and my opinion, but that is assuming people who own cinema cameras don't own mirrorless cameras. I have people say to me and comment all the time on my channel about the fact that you don't need all that with a cinema camera. It's just too much. What if you need to get into a small space? What are you gonna do? How are you gonna mount that on a car? And my answer is, I'm not. I'm gonna use a mirrorless camera for that. Me personally, I own 2 mirrorless cameras and a cinema camera currently. I've owned more mirrorless cameras in the past, and I'm probably gonna buy more in the future. And I know a lot of colleagues and friends of mine who also own 1 or 2 cinema cameras and also quite a few mirrorless cameras to back that cinema camera up or use it in place of the cinema camera if they just don't need it, because I'll be honest, you don't always need a cinema camera. But when you do, you're often getting paid a lot more, you're often rigging it out, and it's in a place where a mirrorless camera simply couldn't replace it, especially if you need SDI straight from the camera for an AC's monitor or a director's monitor. There are times where just having a cinema camera is necessary, and a mirrorless camera can't replace it. Well, that's just my little ending rant. Thank you guys so much for watching. Comment down below any other things you think people say about cinema cameras or mirrorless cameras that let the world know that they're new to the industry. Thank you guys for watching, and until next time.